If you've spent the last few evenings scrolling through endless rows of desoldering stations, trying to decide whether you need a heavyweight pro tool or just a decent hobbyist setup, you're not alone. The fear of overpaying for something that sits half-used on a bench, or worse, buying a cheap unit that can't keep up with a stubborn lead-free joint, is real. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. In this video I'm going to walk through the Hakko FR41053, point out where it actually saves you time and money, and tell you exactly who should click add to cart and who would be better off looking elsewhere. First off, let's talk about the kind of work that usually drives a purchase like this. I've been soldering and desoldering on everything from vintage radios to the latest Raspberry Pi hats for the past 8 years. The moments that make a desoldering station worth the investment are the ones where you're pulling a cluster of pins from a densely packed board, or when you have to remove a large heat-sinked component without frying the surrounding traces. In those scenarios, a weak vacuum or a low-temperature sealing can turn a quick fix into a half-day ordeal. The Hakko FR41053 positions itself as a high-power option. With 140 watts feeding the handpiece, it can push the tip up to roughly 850 F. That temperature range is hot enough to melt lead-free solder reliably, which is important because many of the newer boards you'll encounter use the higher melting SNAGCU alloys. The vacuum side puts out a maximum of 24 inches of mercury, and the flow rate is listed at 15 L per minute. In plain English, that means the suction is strong enough to lift a decent amount of molten solder in a single burst, and the airflow is fast enough that the molten metal doesn't have a chance to recondense on the tip and cause drips. Now, why does that matter in a real workshop? Imagine you're rescuing a damaged microcontroller from a board that suffered a water spill. You need to heat the pins quickly, lift the solder, and move on before the board's other components start to get overheated. With the FR41053's combination of high temperature and solid vacuum, you can set the tip to, say, 720 F, give the joint a few seconds, then press the trigger and watch a clean column of solder disappear into the collection cup. The whole process takes maybe 10 seconds per pin, which is a noticeable speed boost over a lower-powered station that would require multiple reheats and longer suction bursts. On the flip side, that power comes with a couple of practical trade-offs. The unit is built into a fairly sizable chassis, roughly the size of a small desktop monitor. If your bench space is limited, you'll need to carve out a dedicated spot for it, and the weight means you can't just toss it into a tool bag and carry it to a client's site. It's more of a studio tool than a field companion. Also, the high suction force can be a bit aggressive on delicate components. I've seen a few users unintentionally pull a tiny surface mount capacitor off the board when the tip is positioned too close. The cure is simple: keep the tip a millimeter or two away from the component you're not trying to remove, and use the variable suction dial to dial down the pull when you're working on fine-pitch ICs. Who should consider buying this station? If you're a serious hobbyist or a small shop technician who routinely works on multi-layer boards, power electronics, or any project where you need to desolder multiple leads at once, the FR41053 hits a sweet spot between just enough power and overkill. It also makes sense for educators who need a reliable unit that can demonstrate both soldering and desoldering without constantly swapping tips or worrying about temperature limits. The fact that it can sustain 850 F means you won't have to constantly adjust settings when you switch between leaded and lead-free solder, which saves you time during class demos. Conversely, if your typical job is fixing a few hobbyist kits, replacing a single resistor, or you only need a portable solution for on-the-go repairs, this might be more machine than you need. A lower wattage, lighter desoldering iron can still do the job for occasional use, and you'll save a few $100s plus bench space. Also, if you're working in a very small enclosure where the suction plume could blow dust onto nearby sensitive equipment, the 15 liters per minute flow could be a nuisance unless you add an external extraction system. Let's dig into the day-to-day ergonomics. The pencil-style handpiece feels familiar to anyone who's used a traditional soldering iron. It's thin, balanced, and the trigger is smooth. The tip change mechanism is quick. You just push the button, slide the old tip out, and snap a new one in. That matters when you're switching between a fine 0.4mm tip for delicate SMD work and a broader 1.5mm tip for larger through-hole components. The collection cup holds a respectable amount of solder before you need to empty it.